So this is exciting for me. A little jittery, but I'm still presenting and doing trainings for our office and in other settings. So I was just really excited for the evolution of the DEI committee here in Wilsonville. The amazing community that you all are. I live in Wilsonville, so this is even more special for me. But I do want to start with some thank yous, and then I'll jump in a little bit about who I am, and then jump into what we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to make sure that it's a little more interactive, just because it is a topic that is so misunderstood, as we all know. And if you're here today and you've been participating in this series overall, you want to learn, you want to embrace and have better understanding so that you can continue to do your own investigation and research on these important topics historically, societally, and just in so many layers. So I want to thank first, first the DEI council members that are here from Wilsonville. I see definitely, Diane, so raise your hand if you're a part of the committee. I know there's a couple of folks here. I also want to thank my beautiful teammates that were willing to come from Salem to join me tonight. Ms. Susie Hosey, who is our Director of Human Resources at the Higher Education Coordinating Commission. And I wanted to say she is a native member of Rivera tribe in North Dakota. And then my friend and colleague also, Rebecca Arce, she came on to the Higher Education Coordinating Commission about a little over a year ago now, or maybe longer, when the legislative session granted me what I needed and money to fund more positions to continue doing this work for our state of Oregon. So Rebecca Arce is also here. With our comfort dog, now mascot, Tony Stark is his name. Mr. Tony Stark is in the room. So I just want to again thank, and I have to appreciate, I'm here today coming to you with 28 years of education experience. I was a former high school teacher, intervention specialist, teacher leader for equity, and that eventually caught the eye of folks at the state level, out of the governor's office. When the Oregon Department of Education created its first equity unit, I was recruited to be a part of that, to look at policy and practices through an equity lens, through working understanding of how do we help to serve all our students in culturally responsive ways. I eventually came back. After working at the Oregon Department of Education for about 5 years, I was recruited back to Clackamas County at the Clackamas Education Service District as their first equity administrator, and I got to serve all the school districts within Clackamas County and their support there. I only did that for 2 years when I was recruited back to the state, when the Higher Education Coordinating Commission was approved to fill a new role of an equity or a diversity, equity, inclusion position at the executive level with the executive team. And thank goodness I was hired. And I've been doing this ever since. I got hired right before COVID hit, so it became an added challenge to try to do equity work or DEI work through Zoom, through virtual means. And so I love what I do. I am originally from Bayamón, Puerto Rico. So I'm not from Oregon, but I've lived here for 20 years and have served here 20 years plus. And I want to honor my parents who just literally left Colorado to move to Florida. But they just celebrated 49 years of marriage this week. So I need to honor them because they are in me as I talk and I channel them and of course everyone else before me in this important work. So my father, again, we're from Puerto Rico, but he served, for those who know about the island of Puerto Rico, we are a U.S. territory. So my father was able to join the U.S. Army, and he served for 30 years and retired a lieutenant colonel. Thank you. My mother, she was the best mom on the planet. She did 2 years of college, but decided to take care of us full time. And so I share all of this with you all because number one, there's not a lot of Puerto Ricans in Oregon. Number two is so that, we can tell, by telling these stories, we interrupt one-story narratives about certain groups of folks. I identify as a Latina female leader in this work, but I am from Puerto Rico, which is very different from someone from Mexico or Guatemala or Venezuela or other countries. And so I share this because I love people to learn and know more about that, right? And so, but this is what I come from. I come from as a servant leader. I come and approach this work in ways to bring equity work to what ultimately we're trying to do is find the humanity in all of us and see the success in all of that and figure it all out together so that we can start creating systems that can serve everybody if we can in the community, right? So understanding systemic racism in education. I let Zoe know, I'm like, okay, that's a really big topic, so I want to just kind of set expectation that this topic by itself, typically in the DEI world, can be 2 whole day trainings just on the topic because of the historical depth of it. So what I just want to introduce for you all today is more about how we in post-secondary education and training is defining equitable outcomes and equity in general, but really understanding the working definition of systemic racism or structural racism in education and what that means, and then provide some strategies for you all to use or utilize that we know are tried and true on how you can participate and help dismantling some of these things that continue to perpetuate disparity in our communities. So that said, anytime I engage in these type of conversations, because of, like I said, the importance of working definitions, as you all know, you're all here because you're interested in these topics. And we know that at the national level and the news and different folks talk about it, and it just becomes so misunderstood and so muddled. Equity work can be very subjective work. So it's always important, number one, to have working agreements as we engage in these type of discussions and conversations, but also define what it means so that we can demystify and minimize fear and misunderstanding in order to start coming to consensus and working towards solutions in different problems. So these working agreements, typically this is another training in and of itself where when we're trying to find consensus, we agree to these, but these particular agreements come from Glenn Singleton's work out of Oakland. If you're familiar with the curriculum of Courageous Conversations About Race, he uses staying engaged. So recognizing that this is can be difficult or draining, especially if you're doing an all-day training on this. So staying engaged just means take care of yourselves, do what you need to do, but be present as we're trying to continue learning together. A big agreement in this work, because not a lot of people are used to talking about it or engaging in this level of understanding, you start to begin to experience discomfort. And what I want to encourage folks and remind folks is that that's normal and it's okay, because we don't know what we don't know. So we agree to experience discomfort and assume best intent because people are still trying to learn and understand. I'm very proud and fortunate to say that in my 28 years of doing this work, I can honestly say that if I were to think about a percentage, around 87% of folks come to this work really trying and seeking to understand. It's only been a small percentage of folks that have, been belligerent about it or come at me sideways because they don't understand and they just don't like the topic. So I stay in this work because I believe in it, and the long-term commitment to this does prove fruitful. And we just had an example of a big win at the HEC today in working with our community colleges. So experience discomfort, we're assuming best intent when folks ask questions. So this just acknowledges that the discomfort is inevitable, especially in dialogues about race, and that participants, we make a commitment to bring those issues into the open. It's not talking about these issues that create divisiveness, but it's the divisiveness that already exists in society, in our schools, but it's through dialogue, even when uncomfortable, that healing can happen. The next one is speak your truth responsibly and acknowledge that impact. We welcome, again, those questions when you don't know what you don't know, right? But sometimes there are folks, unfortunately, that will take full advantage and just say something blatantly disrespectful to cause turmoil. And so I just ask that, as you share, think about the impact of the folks that are in this room, because even here we have such a diverse group of representation that we want to do this and engage in productive discourse or productive dialogue on this topic. Expect and accept non-closure. A lot of folks think that they want to come to these type of trainings or figure it out really quick and come out with a solution right away. Equity work, I always say, is like watching molasses go down a tree or syrup go down a tree, and it's just really slow work because we are bumping against systemic barriers in the work. So recognizing that we're not going to solve it today, but we're going to start a conversation in this hour to get you thinking, to get you wondering, to just, allow you to engage in your learning and expansion of these topics. And so I always put honor confidentiality, because a lot of the time when I engage in these type of trainings or discussions, I'm actually in smaller groups with teams and teachers and administrators. And folks want to make sure that when they become vulnerable, because they do and they share their stories, that it's not that it's being put out on blast, but because this is a public meeting and it's being recorded, and I'll wave to the camera, I just want to honor and say that if, typically too, folks like to come and talk to me directly after the fact, and just know that those stories or that insight, unless it's something we can use to, with your permission, to lift up or address a situation, I will not repeat what is shared with me. So I keep that in the space so folks understand that that's just how we roll, especially at the HEC. So I just want to ground ourselves in the discussion. So with a partner, everybody has someone next to them. Just talk or ground yourselves in what you understand or know about systemic or structural racism. Do you know what it is? And what does that mean to you? Go. We got about 4 minutes. Oh my gosh, so it doesn't sound like you had anything to talk about. This is fantastic. Okay, so we do have time for a couple of share outs. So what do you understand about systemic or structural racism? And if you match the definition that I have, then we're done. No, I'm kidding. Kidding. So who would like to share if you're comfortable? And we have a microphone to share out loud too. What do you understand about structural racism or systemic racism? Ooh.
I think that the Constitution of this country is very much clear about all being equal. However, the condition of man, how he has created his neighborhood, etc., is divided. Nowadays we talk about the black people, but in the early days there were women who were also persecuted and were not allowed to own properties, etc. The black people could come on the railroad here, but they could not own properties. These conditions are changing bit by bit, but it is the mindset of the children. The mindset of children needs to be trained to accept people of all color and of all race, and not to judge people because of their skin color or because where they were born or their hairdos, etc.
Love it. Thank you. Thank you so much. One more. Maybe two.
I'll just try a few thoughts. So I started thinking about what is not, and maybe it's not the same as personal racism. There may be a great deal of overlap. There may be people involved in structures that are personally racist and others who are personally not, or others who are trying very hard not to be. But that's different from whether the system presents obstacles to equal outcomes or equal opportunities. So for example, when we're talking about education, you can think of things like how well-resourced is the school compared to some other school. What kind of conditions are people coming to school in terms of have they had enough to eat, have they had shelter, that sort of thing. How are folks able to get along with each other in the school as opposed to focus on learning? Are the tests really testing academic achievement, or are they testing something else? When you get to college age, are you there's one example is that there's a certain amount of legacy spots in college that are reserved for the children of alumni, and is that structurally changing the playing field one way or another? So just some examples.
That's excellent. What is your name, sir?
Oh, I'm Sage Suratori.
Hi, thank you. We have time for one more.
I think it just governs, it's everything about how we live and how we, it's all around. It's kind of like the difference between whether you see water as a fish or as someone standing on the bank. If you're a fish, it's what you live in, and hey, this is just the way things are. Whereas if you don't have gills, it's something that you drown in. So how we hire people, where people are allowed to live, where we build, how we build. The reason that we require college degrees for jobs that don't really need college degrees.
Right.
Who gets admitted to not just to university, but how classes are structured. Within higher education, who's teaching? Do you hire single faculty? Do you do cluster hires? Do you focus on head counting, or do you look at retention and what makes people actually want to work there and how that relates to your students, how you respond to their questions, how you create assignments and even syllabi that will in themselves create barriers that you may not even be aware of. And the question is how receptive is changing that without simply having it seen as an accommodation, and on and on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And what was your name, sir?
Jeff.
Jeff, thank you so much. Oh my goodness. So this is why I was excited. This is a good group. We're on the right track. I mean, all of you are correct in so many ways. The importance, how do I backtrack on this? So it's really important to understand when engaging in this DEI work, it isn't just one focus of understanding to fix it. So a lot of folks believe that the DEI work is just focused just on a racial lens, right? There is that component. We have to start there because our data can easily distinguish based on racial demographics, right? But we recognize the intersectionality of just the multiple dimensions of all our identities, which we'll talk about. So this is why it gets so important to define. My approach to this work and my background, I am grounded in social and behavioral studies. So this is, for me, very sociological and looking at human behavior and society and how we act and recognizing the dynamics in every country, really. We're focused on the U.S., but if we were to ask the question to all of you, and this has been asked of me, is what would happen or what would education in the U.S. look like if we removed white supremacy, which is a part of systemic racism? What would the answer be? I know what my answer is, and they didn't like it. And it's only because the human nature, and she spoke to it, tell me your name again? Farah spoke to it so beautifully, is that human nature in the history of the world, right? There's always somebody vying to be supreme and keep somebody else down, whether it's because they live on a certain plot of land or they want this over here and resources. And so how do we get more open-minded and realize that connectivity, right? So I approach it that way. I look through the history. History is being attacked right now at so many levels. At so many levels, and I won't even jump into it because that'll take a whole other 5 hours at a soapbox that we don't want right now. Just because it is impacting the work that we get to do. history, the psychology of it all. So there's just so many components that we have to understand about human nature and how this stuff plays out. So we have to start with working definitions. When we can start with a common understanding, then we can begin to look at, well, what's playing out over here, or what can we do with that? If I were to ask every one of you to define equity, I guarantee, how many people are in the space right now, Zoe? Did you count? So 45 to 50, I would have 45 to 50 different answers of what equity is. That's how subjective it is, because it really depends on your personal experience and what you've lived, right? So now we're going to jump into, well, what does all this mean? So at the HEC, I always start with this. So, and the HEC, again, is the acronym, or what we say is the Higher Education Coordinating Commission. And before anybody makes the joke, we always get asked, what the heck is the HEC? So thank you for the laughing, because people are like, blah. So, okay. So the Higher Education Coordinating Commission is its own entity, and we're a small but mighty state agency, and probably the youngest, right, out of all state agencies? We are not connected to the Oregon Department of Education, which is full K-12. The Early Learning Division just became its own state agency. So we all have our equity commitment. So it's important to understand that Oregon had adopted an equity lens way back in 2011 under Governor Kitzhaber, when he formed the Oregon Education Investment Board, which was a group of experts that was very courageous and started acknowledging and seeing that we had racial disparity in our educational outcomes. So they decided to create this document that could be used intentionally as a tool to analyze policy, resource decisions, who's being impacted, how are things going to go if we make this type of investment. That's the lens. So folks talk about an equity lens. In Oregon, we actually have an adopted document. So that document was created between the HEC, ODE, the governor's office, all these things. And since then, since 2011, it has evolved. So the HEC now has its own version of that to address the goals and the vision for post-secondary education and training here in Oregon. So we define equity by saying post-secondary education equity will be achieved once one's community or characteristic, including but not limited to racial, ethnic identity, socioeconomic background, disability status, gender status, veteran status, sexual orientation, and geographic origin or location no longer predict inequitable access to and success in post-secondary education and training. And this is the part that we go even deeper on. We will work towards this by addressing the root historical causes of systemic racism and inequities, not just their manifestation. So it's that intentional manifestation that I was hired to create, to help operationalize. So this commitment at the HEC, when it was formed in 2013, was made. But when I got hired on, and Susie knows this history because she was there from the beginning, the biggest issue that the HEC had was, well, how do we operationalize this verbal commitment? What does that look like? And we know today that equity work, research, DEI efforts, there is research, there are practices for community engagement, there are ways of doing this work so that we can move the dial forward and not shut it down. So my presence here today, although I am a woman of color, I am Latina, it can be very personal for me at times. But this is very professional too, and I'm bringing you research, I'm bringing you cited information, so that you can go and look for yourselves where all this information is coming from. So we start with, and I love this graphic, and I can't remember the book I pulled it from, it's one of the many I have, but intersectionality. So it refers to the complex, cumulative way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination, such as racism, sexism, and classism, combine, overlap, or intersect, especially in the experience of marginalized individual groups. What I love about this graphic is that it is a depiction of the multidimensional pieces of who we are at any given moment. So race, a lot of the time, dominant culture sees it as something separate from themselves, and they don't realize that even being called white is a racial category. So when you see that you do have race, and you do have all these other pieces of your identity, ethnicity, age, your abilities, your religious beliefs, your economics, where you live, you see that we can start to talk about and find neutral ground in equity work that is applicable. The hardest part of my job, and even when I worked at ODE, was how do I explain equity in rural communities when there is a working understanding that DEI work is just about race. And so it is about saying, well, you have race too, but you also have all these other dynamics at play. So I think about a young male in Ontario, Oregon, with a disability whose father got laid off because a company shut down, right? So there's a lot of intersections of different points of the identity that could be impacting their success. So that is applicable all across the state. So when we can recognize that all of us fit into this together, then we can move forward, which means we have culture, there's diversity, there's race, there's everything that we can find common ground on to move forward. So culturally responsive is another approach that we take. So if we all agree that we have race, then we all agree we all have culture. So that means that when we're trying to be culturally responsive as state folks who we're serving all of Oregon, we are being culturally responsive to the needs based on the communities we're serving. And so the needs in Portland metro area will look very different from Southern Oregon, from the coast, from Eastern Oregon. And so our job is to go into those settings and get to know folks and see what's needed, because this is never a one-size-fits-all approach. Never, 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 never. People try, but it's just not. So culturally responsive refers to the implicit use of cultural knowledge and prior experiences and frames of reference and performance styles of the diverse individual students or communities, I would say, in order to make learning or access more appropriate and effective for them. In this particular case, when we think about education, there's huge conversations around how teachers can be culturally responsive in their classrooms. And so there's been a lot of work and training of teachers so that they can reach their students in a variety of creative and beautiful ways so they can access the content they're trying to learn. So culturally responsive pays into that, but it is applicable in the way we approach community engagement, applicable the way we approach community services. It's very, it's applicable in all of it. And so yeah, if you don't know to do that and you come in with one view of something, it's likely we will offend or hurt or cause harm in the community instead of help. So now the big question, the million-dollar question, what is systemic racism? I found this image and it just resonated with me because students, depending on what walk of life they come from, depending on what culture they are, they may not have access to someone guiding them through the maze that is our system. And accessing, how do you access pathways? How do you know? Like right now in post-secondary education and training, we keep hearing from the K-12 side that our high schoolers don't know how to access scholarships. They don't know that there's different pathways that they could take to achieve their goals. So we have to, even more so now than ever, with post-pandemic behaviors now playing out, with mental health increasing needs, homelessness is increasing, so many things. The need is so great. We need to support people, not enable, not make them feel bad, but we can still empower and still guide. And so that's the part that folks sometimes miss, is that they think it's a handout or not a hand up, when it's supposed to be the latter. It's supposed to be let's help, but we want to empower so that they can keep going forward. So systemic racism then, and I heard it already in the answers that you provided, it refers to the way in which societal and institutional policies, practices, and norms reinforce and perpetuate racial inequities and discrimination. Systemic racism intentionally benefits our white community while unfairly disadvantaging Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, And it operates at a systemic structural level rather than just individual acts of prejudice and discrimination. So a lot of the time the debate happens because folks want to just assume that these racial incidents that we keep seeing or hearing about was an individual instance, right? Which is true, but there's so much more around it that's perpetuating in the messaging that our news outlets give, in the rules or the policies that people want to try to pass legally. You're sending coded messages, whether they know it or not. And so we have laws, and I'll give examples based on this definition, historically, from the colonial era all the way to now, on the barriers on how policy is actually used to make or break a situation or perpetuate or limit or enhance. So there is a bright side to it, which is why you need to have more folks engaged in what we would call anti-racist work or equity-minded frameworks and thinking through solutions for our communities. Any questions on this one? Because that's big. It's a lot for a Thursday night. Okay.
Could I ask a question that's just purely academic?
Sure.
But in the second paragraph there, if you take systemic racism intentionally benefits, if you were to remove the word intentionally, would the sentence still be useful?
Repeat the question, please. It is intentional. Systemic racism.
That's a very important distinction and question, isn't it?
I mean, yeah, I'm just, is it possible that sometimes some of these structures were set up, we don't know they were set up by our ancestors or whatever, or that we've even set them up kind of inadvertently with other objectives in mind?
I would agree with that. I would say in some cases that there was what we call those unintended consequences, that some folks thought it was a good idea, and then it turned out it wasn't. But we do have very systemic examples of racial hierarchy, where folks definitely wrote laws and policies or statutes specifically calling out a race, right?
There's clearly intentional.
Oh, exactly. But I would agree. I would agree too that this is why it's so important to have multiple perspectives in the creation of policy and practices and rules and regulations, because you need those multiple perspectives to catch those things, right? To really think, one of the equity lens questions is that, have you mitigated and recognized or identified any unintended consequences in this process? And it's true, we're not mind readers or psychics to predict 5-10 years from now, because an unintended consequence can also be good. Like, you didn't plan it. I think about, in a funny example, how the potato chip was accidentally created. That's minimal, it's not race, but it's one of those things that I want folks to understand, that unintended consequences aren't all bad either. But in this particular case, when we're talking about minimizing harm in the work, we have to very seriously consider the unintended consequences, because what sounds like a good idea initially to support ends up blowing up down the road. The most prevalent example I can give in education in K-12 would be the English Learner program. So we've had districts in our state that ended up in civil rights violations because they thought segregating our students, and this happened with students with disabilities also, we can focus on them better if we da-da-da-da. So what happens? They end up in the classroom that's at the back of the school, and they end up over here, and then students are assumed that because they don't speak English, they can't do math, or they can't learn history, and all these other things. So that was a good idea gone bad really quick. And I know this because I was an ESL teacher. And I used to fight tooth and nail on when a student needed to be tested. The English Language Learner Survey literally says, ask 4 questions. And one of them is, does a parent or family member speak another language besides English? You can say they speak English in the 3 other answers. If you say no in regards to your parent, that student is getting tested, whether it's a benefit or not. And that was something I very, very much didn't think that was, I speak Spanish. My son grew up in that. That wasn't a deficit for him, right? So it's assuming a deficit. And that's the systemic piece. which happens all the time. And ESL and special education are the two that get hit the hardest on these do-gooder ideas. Go ahead, Diane.
Rudyane, just take it back a little bit further. Would it help to, instead of the teacher's qualifications being so generic, to concentrate on them so they will have a broader education of how to approach this systemic crisis?
I love that. So yes, I would argue that we at the state level, we're working with our teacher education programs to broaden understandings. You know, I've always been a proponent of, for instance, ESL teaching standards and strategies in special ed should be taught for all teachers, whether they're specializing specifically in that, because of what's happened and played out in the system, right? And so there's a lot of conversations. I can proudly say that we're not there yet, but there's just a lot of good discussions happening right now in our post-secondary system, including collaboration with the licensing boards that are looking at these type of issues more deeply and trying to find solutions or eliminate certain practices that keep perpetuating these outcomes. Great questions. So this is a lengthy slide, and I'm looking at the time. So this is usually not my MO, but I wanted to incorporate some just little examples, and again, encourage folks to do your own investigation, to do your own research, because there's so much out there, but in that, look for credible sources, right? We have a lot of, not a lot of credibility in some areas, so it's just, you gotta be very careful with that. But, so we know that evidence of systemic racism can be seen when you take a close look at areas of society like education, which is what we're focused on today, but it's also in employment, housing, healthcare, the criminal justice system, and immigration policy. We are fortunate at the state in the work that we get to do is that we get to work with other folks in our positions in the other state agencies that deal with all those other areas. And so we get to see the overlap and recognizing that the equity work is applicable in all of it, but really investigating the data in productive ways is where we get the most momentum. I can't do my job, we can't do our job without the data. But I put a note in there that data literacy, which means just the ability to read the data and understand it, is so important in interpreting both quantitative, which is the numbers, and the qualitative information that you see. You know, so it just gets really important. So I think about one of the school districts that I served in this county, they were touting, oh, we have an 85% graduation rate, which is pretty decent when you just leave it at face value. But then when you actually disaggregate, which means, you know, you break it down by groups, male, female, ability, language learners, race, then all of a sudden you start seeing a pattern. And in many cases, those underserved groups are the ones that didn't graduate with that 85%. But that takes a lot of courage to put out there because then it's admitting that the system or the systemic approach or the culture climate has perpetuated these outcomes. It's not about the individual. And there are, you know, a lot of people want to blame the student. Well, they didn't work hard enough, or they were just a troublemaker, or all these things. That's not true. It can happen. It is true that there's like kids that are going to be kids, but the system, the way it's set up a lot of times doesn't make it easy for students to navigate and succeed. So we want to be mindful of that. So in education, what you need to be looking at, and I didn't have time to pull, Susie gave me this idea, I was like, oh, we should pull Westland-Wilsonville school data. I'm happy to say, because I live in the community and I've worked with the district, I'm happy to say that I live in this community and I actually worked with this district too, and they're definitely doing some significant equity work with their teachers, and you know, you go into their boardroom, you see their equity lens question, at least the last time I went in, you know, they're trying to be conscious about it. Again, like all districts, it's not perfect, but they are trying. And so I don't know, I can't tell you what the data is here, but I would encourage you to look and you know, just look at the data and see what you find. But you'll see it in school discipline, in resource allocation, look at your completion rates, those grad rates, look at the culture climate. Is it asset-based? Is it deficit, right? A lot of the time when we talk about our underserved populations, people want to feel sorry. And it's not about that. It's definitely have that empathy, right? But we want to empower. We want to bring these kids along. We want to recognize that even in the chaos that some people might live in, there's resiliency, there's strength, there's survival to be and move forward, right? So culture climate is a big issue in a lot of our schools, including in post-secondary. Access to pathways and healthy transitions. We have students of color and some students being tracked into certain career pathways based on their race or their ethnicity. That's still happening today. So we have examples in the data, and you can see it. For instance, to better paint the picture, stereotypically we will have white male students tracked into computer science and business classes, while Latino male students are being tracked into courses on landscaping. Yes, sir.
I'm so naive to this stuff, but is it being proactively pushed or is it culturally? And I truly say that naively, that I'm constantly kind of trying to correct my son and saying, did you see white people out in the landscape? You see Hispanic people out in the landscape. You see Hispanic people doing one thing. It doesn't matter. The brains are still the brains, but I think culturally,
Yes.
and I'm admitting, if you see dad do it, you see mom do it, you do it regardless. And so I'm sort of going, if that becomes maybe cultural, why is that considered racism? Because to me, racism is a proactive, somebody's trying to push somebody down. If it's culturally, and I'll admit, just because somebody goes on the landscape business, they can have an extremely successful business. We sometimes, you could be a successful mechanic that are making well over.
Absolutely.
So I sort of almost arch my back a little bit saying, help me understand where racism versus, anyway.
No, I love that. That's a great question. Please, please, please do not construe that landscaping is bad or mechanics or anything like that, because those are very lucrative businesses for sure. Not all students go to a 4-year institution. There's career technical pathways, all of that. The issue I'm speaking about is when the student's being guided. It's different when they say, hey, I want to go landscape because my father is doing this. Same with a son or a daughter becoming a police officer because the whole family grew up in policing and teachers and all of that. What we find patterns of, and this is unfortunate reality, is with those students that come in and say, hey, I want to be a mechanical engineer, and then the teacher or counselor will say, well, let's get you to go this way, right? That's what I'm referring to. And that is an unfortunate, this is where when districts, school districts in particular, or any system of agency or institution want to look at operationalizing an equity commitment, they have to incorporate a learning component to support culture, climate, and process. Because those little shifts in understanding and awareness, or having a tool to intentionally, like if you're talking with a student and you're actually wanting to keep your bias in check, or you're having a bad day, or you're tired, and you need to keep that in check while serving the families that you're working with, that's when operationalizing the work becomes real, right? And so nothing wrong with landscaping, nothing wrong with staying home, nothing wrong with any of that. It's folks assuming that that's where they need to be when the student is actually voicing and the family's voicing a different goal. That's the issue we're facing. Yes, sir.
Are you saying then that these students are tracked in a certain direction because of their race, or because they don't have the language ability, or they don't have the intellectual ability to, say, be a mechanical engineer? I mean, is it just race, or is it the other thing?
It could be a bunch of different reasons. It depends on the student. It could be if a young lady comes into and she wants to say, she wants to do something that's traditionally considered male, and she's basically encouraged not to do it for XYZ reason, right? I think about sports, and that line, right? I think about career pathways. So it could be. In some cases it is about race, and they're like, well, and then in other cases it's, well, maybe it's this, right?
This happens to white kids as well.
Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
Just But piggybacking on that, just think about in general in education, since we're talking about that, women are primary school educators,
Yes.
and then high school and above are men. Obviously, there's exceptions, but just there is that bent, you know,
Right.
medical, women are nurses and men are doctors.
Absolutely. Yes. No, this is good. This is good. Yes, ma'am.
Question, you mentioned resource allocation. Would you please talk about that in terms of equity measures? And assigning enough resources to students of color to be able to succeed?
Thank you for that question. It's a tough one only because of the lack of certain resources, and it depends on each community, right? And so some communities have more wealth than others. Some pass different laws or levies in different situations that basically produce what a school district would receive resource-wise. Then we're dealing right now at the state level of our budgets need to be finalized so our schools can get what they need. And, we have some drama going on in the legislation right now if you're following that. So it's the equity piece is, there are more and more folks that are trying to engage in using their lens on purpose intentionally to look at resource allocation and how monies are being spent. And so I was in a situation just yesterday, for instance, where they were analyzing their budget and they realized that 80% of their budget went to staff. And that was an intentional decision, right? And so that decision or that validation only came through because the group that was analyzing it actually used their equity lens that they adopted to really look intentionally at how they're doing those decisions, right? And so not everybody is there though. So sometimes there's a default response to how budgets are handled. So it just depends on the community and the situation.
So obviously there is a problem.
Right.
That's suspected. So it sounds like it's being ignored perhaps.
Right. No, these are great questions. Yes, one more.
Using the how students are steered as an example, it's also self-perpetuating. It's a big piece of it, whether intentional or not, and getting growth. Hiring. That person wouldn't be a good fit here. Gee, I wonder why we have the same demographics year in, year out, regardless of that. What would your mission statement have? Or, if we want someone to advance in the field and it has no mentors or role models,
Correct.
or anyone that, there's no one who looks like me there, or there's no one who's even willing to see me as someone who can be there, that doesn't solve itself. So it goes on and on.
Right.
Cycle and cycle.
That's an excellent point. So this is why equity work is so hard, is because anytime we're trying to fix something, there's always something else that bumps into it, or and depending on the community, it's just something that, they've just always worked this way, right? How many times have we heard, well, it's always been that way, right? And so that's an example, and I'm looking at the time. That's an example true of those teacher trainings, how we train our teachers, how we do our hiring practices and retention rates. So the policies, though, that created, and back to the gentleman's question around intentional versus unintended, we had racial hierarchy policies that have been written historically in our nation. So from colonial era till now, there are laws and behaviors have been adopted, and we heard also this idea of laws perpetuating behavior or expectation to create barriers and perpetuate those deficit perceptions. And so examples include, and again, this is every one of these topics has to be a massive download of training and just research, based on what you're interested in. But we have examples, for instance, in the colonial area, the beginning was the anti-literacy statutes. When slavery was happening, the owners did not want slaves learning or reading because they were fearful of an uprising or them, educating themselves enough, right? So there were anti-literacy statutes formed. We had forced segregation in the Jim Crow era, very real. Removal of our Native American children into boarding schools. That was a federal mandate based on race. Exclusionary laws. Oregon was riddled with them. The state of Oregon strived to be a white utopia. They banned slavery. And so in order to keep people, black families of color out, and then that attitude then was subjected to anybody else who was different trying to live in the state. So in Oregon alone, had the sundown towns, had the redlining, which I know you learned about in the first session of this series. So that's just nationally. But then when we look at Oregon, some of the foundation that we're struggling with, recognizing again, these are all big topics. So I mentioned this began as a whites-only state through a series of black exclusionary laws that were designed to discourage black Americans from living here. That racist language was not removed from Oregon's constitution until 2002. So that's a little scary for me. And just last year, they finally, I think it was like 55% of folks voted to remove the slavery language out of the Constitution pertaining to incarcerated folks. Just last year. And it almost stayed. That's what's scary about that one. For Oregon's native tribes, the arrival of settlers were often violent and would lead to a systemic upheaval of the state's first people and broken treaties. OPB has a great documentary called Broken Treaties, if you haven't seen it, and that really speaks to the history of our non-confederated tribes here in the state. For our Latino communities, the impacts of the federal Bracero program established a growing migrant population here, but with the foundation of all this, if you're a different color, you're not supposed to be here, they also got the brunt of a lot of discrimination and racism and hate. And at the same time thrived. What's amazing about all of this is that people stayed. We're here. World War II would bring the displacement of our Japanese American communities out of the state into camps. There's a great memorial in downtown Portland, if you haven't seen it, that speaks to the history of the Japanese displacement. And then, of course, students with severe disabilities were often not served in their designated schools. So Oregon also has a not pretty history, and most states don't have a history in serving students with special needs. So all of that with laws have been remedied or trying to be remedied, but we still know that some of this stuff still filters into the system, unfortunately, and that's why when we have our bad days, it's because we hear of these stories, especially during the legislative session when people are doing public testimony to try to change something. Those stories are very real. So how do we get to dismantle the system? So I don't want to leave you on a hopeless note. There are things you can do. So strategies that can be used to interrupt. If you're a part of a system or an agency and you have adopted an equity commitment, being intentional about having an equity framework or intentional lens to speak to your comment around allocation of resources. You can't begin to look at that unless you incorporate more people to actually investigate how these monies are being spent. They always say that where the money goes is where your priority is. So, get involved with that on what that could look like. As community members, you can confirm and speak up about the importance of identifying urgently, addressing institutional and systemic barriers that limit access and success for many students. Engage with your school leaders and local elected officials in strategic efforts to prioritize racial equity outcomes and other equitable outcomes. Continue to listen and learn from the communities and then plan for action. Becoming an ally intentionally means continuing to learn, continuing to listen, and then humbly participating in wherever cause that strikes your heart so that you can be present in those moments. And then, of course, support and participate in initiatives that address those inequities and other disparities. So, and I wrote a separate little note that in 2021, the HEC adopted their new updated version of their lens, which we just turned into the governor's office just last week, our brand new DEI agency plan in process. So other ways to consider when you're thinking about policy and rules, recognizing that our default systematically has always been to do like a universal solution to something, which tends to is a way of signaling the desire for diverse and equitable society, but can strike people, especially who have been oppressed for generations, as being too grand and ambitious. So sometimes we choose a solution that's so big that we don't reach the mark of what we're trying to achieve. Then on the other side, when we try to go too targeted, then we end up missing a lot of points around that, and then it can be viewed as a zero-sum perspective, causing hostility and resentment. So the approach the state has taken in all state agencies, and you can see this in the state DEI action plan, is the new work around targeted universalism from John C. Powell out of California. And what that means is we're trying to look at an alternative framework to design policies and implementation strategies to achieve the policy goals. So targeted universalism is sensitive to structural and cultural dynamics in ways that often elude both targeted and universal strategies. So as the state of Oregon, if we have an overarching goal, we can have that, but we have to recognize that if I go serve in NISA, Oregon, what NISA needs is not what's going to be what Portland has, right? So that's where the targeted ideas come in, but we always have to be focused on the overarching goal. So the goal is always to move from status quo to transformation, and in that, that's that asset-based approach where we focus on the transformation, we authentically engage students and their families' voice, we value the different ways of knowing and learning, and we see and understand community cultural wealth, and then build relationships towards working restoration and healing. So questions to consider and process, and you can sleep on it, we don't have to talk about it, but it's just something for you to think about, is as you engage and continue in this learning, how do we authentically continue to center students and family in the education setting? Because the unfortunate part about our data in Oregon is that we're still failing kids, we're still failing families. And as an educator, that breaks my heart every day. And so how do we continue to really bring their voices to implement and encourage the change that needs to happen so that everybody gets what they need to be successful in this society? What is the role of leadership and workforce partners in supporting that? And then what is still missing from Oregon's current education system? If you had the perfect education system, what would that be? If we weren't based on racial hierarchy, if we weren't based on deficit thinking, what would our education system be today if we all rallied to make that change? So, and I'll leave you with this, and this is from an anonymous educator. Whenever we allow people's identities to be a barrier, not an asset, we begin to see unnecessary distinctions. So it's important to value people's unique identities as assets to a full fabric of a beautiful mosaic of difference, diversity, belonging, and humanity. That's my goal, that's what I live by, and I just so thank you for your time and space today. So any questions, any thoughts? Yes, ma'am.
I would say if you're lucky enough to have an ordinance or a mandate passed, please hold their feet to the fire and have them implement that mandate or ordinance or law.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Get into good trouble.
Good trouble, yes. Yes, sir.
It occurred to me, and I don't know if this is done, but wouldn't it help to try to get some of the students involved to help their fellow immigrant students learn English?
Absolutely.
There would be a lot of students who'd be willing to do that.
There are some good.
You could even form a club.
Yes. There are some schools that have actually taken those type of actions. There's 197 school districts in the state, with different allocations of resources and whatnot, and so a lot of different things happening, but it's still a lot of work to do. Yes, sir.
Well, I just wanted to point out for people who don't know that we have one of the greatest thing for children in terms of education, diversity, equity, and inclusion here in Wilsonville, because one of the largest nonprofits that's based for helping Hispanic people is based here, Oregon Child Development Coalition.
Yes, they're an amazing group.
And how many people has that changed in its history here? And most people don't even know it exists here. But this is helping the children of migrant and seasonal farm workers.
Yes.
So that's 95% Hispanic community, and it's a pretty major thing that's going on there, because there are very few Head Starts that are focused just on that.
Yes.
So we can be proud of having that originate here. It's in Wilsonville, and it affects thousands of children across all of Oregon from that community.
Thank you for sharing that. That's what I want to uplift. This is one of the reasons why I live in Wilsonville. This is where I have felt more for the state of Oregon and this community. I feel pretty like myself, where, that's pretty cool because of the diversity in the room is why I appreciate this space so much. Yes, ma'am.
Are there any groups in Oregon that are working to help prevent the education of systemic racism in our society? Like there's other states who are going against the 1619 project, that type of thing, and forbidding teachers to teach about racism in our society. Is there any groups in our state that are trying to promote that?
Promote the negative side or the positive interruption?
They're trying to stop any type of educational access to systemic racism.
Oh, that's a very loaded question, ma'am. So I would say every state has a group, right, that tries to go against. In Oregon, and I'm looking at my team as I carefully say this, a lot of folks at groups of perspectives are showing up in the different school boards, as you know, and there are people affiliated with white nationalist groups that are trying to come in and do what they do. And we are fortunate to live in a state, though, and this is where I am proud. We haven't figured it all out, but Oregon is leading the way in how we try to interrupt and approach education equity nationally. And so in K-12, we've been recognized, in post-secondary at our level, we've been recognized on trying to do right by the work, even though our data keeps showing our outcomes aren't great. We're one of the lowest in the nation for our graduation rates. We're one of the lowest in the nation with mental health resources. We know we have a dire now homeless crisis, or houseless crisis in our state. But what I can say is that Oregon has so many beautiful advocacy groups from different communities that are really trying and doing better in doing this together as opposed to isolated efforts. So we're getting more attuned to the need to approach these attacks systematically. But they do exist. In Oregon, when you look at the history of race here in Oregon, I think at last count, we have 8 official hate group headquarters in this state. I think Washington has like 20.
How about Idaho?
Idaho is another one, yeah. So they exist, they're here like everywhere else. I just don't think that the bills that have been introduced, haven't gone as far, for instance, in the legislative session as it has in other places in other states. Because we do have very proactive people trying to interrupt that. Go ahead, Rebecca.
And just to add on to that, a lot of the teacher education programs, so the people that are teaching the next generation of teachers,
yes,
they have to have and turn into our agency their equity plan.
Right.
So you have to be proactive in teaching teachers how to interrupt.
Exactly. So there's efforts like that where we're trying to systematically approach that. Yes, sir.
So I had lunch a couple of days ago with a friend who's a faculty at a university. It's a private university, so not part of the public system, but I was surprised to hear about how the evaluation process for faculty, at least at that particular university, was just kind of a sham. And it perpetuates incompetence with faculty, which of course hurts the students. So I was wondering if the HEC has any involvement with faculty review or competence or standards or anything like that, or is that just kind of not out of the purview?
That's a great question, and this is my sad answer. We're a coordinating commission, and we don't have as much legislative authority that let's say the Oregon Department of Education has. What we do have control over are the 24 public institutions and their money, the funding, giving them their state funds for that. But the 24 institutions are like school districts. There's local control. So even when you give money, we can add layers of accountability. We have to report on key performance measures of the institutions and look at their boards. But as far as controlling over how they train faculty, we don't have that luxury, correct? I'm looking at Susie.
No, we don't. That's because we get full peer testimony, student testimony. There's all kinds of stories, right? And that's one of the systemic originations and them setting up that system,
Right,
receiving tenure, and you know the whole structure is not something that
correct.
we don't have authority over. So we encourage students then to, you know, talk to the trustees or talk to the, you know, which then comes a whole other dynamic that they have to deal with, but we don't have that authority. It constantly gets revisited every legislative session. So those are things that through advocacy and, you know, that can come from communities to say, here's what we want. But we do not have that right now.
We don't have that. There's a lot of, you know, for the state of Oregon, there's local control. Then we have union protecting the teachers and folks for, you know, for good reasons. There's needs for unions too. But to your point, if there's a situation of a teacher not doing really what they're supposed to be doing, we don't have say, you got to remove them unless somebody complains and it's a civil rights violation, and it's up to the institution to do what they need to do for that situation. But what we do have control over is just voicing best practice, culturally responsive practices, and, you know, encouraging folks. But right now, like in many career fields, we're dealing with teacher shortages, and we're dealing with nurses shortages, and so many things are happening that, you know, it's just making it harder. And so the teachers that do stay and are there, they're just getting taxed and overworked. And then in some cases, not getting paid that extra for doing that extra. So, great question. Yes, sir.
Many years ago, I got involved with the ESL program in Illinois. And I worked with an immigrant for 2 years. And I really enjoyed it. In fact, I helped him get his commercial driver's license to drive an 18-wheeler. His prior job, he was handling carts at the really the big box stores. But anyway, I'd like to get involved again. Where's an ESL training program or organization?
Oh my God. Oh, you go to your local school, connect with the OCDC. OCDC looks for volunteers all the time. The Latino Network in Portland. That's the Oregon Coalition of Oregon Child Development, and that's literally over there right by the Carl's Jr. or that way. I used to have colleagues there. It's an amazing organization.
So you guys mentioned something about the next generation of educators.
Yes.
Kind of having the Oregon university programs that have teaching programs kind of have that intentional statement of like what their equity plan is. What's the follow-up on that? How are they held accountable to doing what that says to do? And is there any across-the-board educational requirements of like the expansion of what you have a teacher take before getting out of a teaching program, including that special ed and or ESL type of knowledge? Is that happening? Are we changing the requirements to a measurable place where you can get that data, where you can follow through, where you can say at this point we changed this requirement in the education system, and 10 years later we hopefully see something that we can actually report on?
I love that question because accountability is the theme that's definitely coming from our community members. And that one gets a little more complicated too because it's the Oregon Department of Education that sets the standards, that sets the data that school districts have to submit and look at. And then school districts fall under what they call the Division 21 and 22 statutes, that there's just a list of stuff that districts have to be doing. What we know is that because of capacity, there hasn't been a lot of folks to follow through. So if something is violated within those divisions, somebody has to report in order to trigger the visit from ODE, right? And so they're working on that. I know there was a bill introduced this legislative session to add that extra layer of accountability. But again, with local control, there's those overarching pieces. And so the capacity to go to every district out of the 197, it's just really hard unless something egregious comes up or there's active parent participation, keeping the district accountable in that context. So, but we're trying. Yes, sir.
Part of the structure is maintaining the status quo at all costs. So if you look at all the changes that have come about over the last however many years, unions, civil service law, tenure, all those were intended to change the status quo that was really hard, and yet all of those have simply now become their own status quo, which they will just as jealously defend as what they tried to change decades or centuries ago. Any new change, it seems like a big part of the battle is keeping it from simply becoming the next status quo and the next ever.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. So I'm looking at Zoe. This is why I told you this topic should not be talked about in an hour. Everybody's so interested in it. But here, I want to leave you all with this. As many things that are still happening that are popping up of injustice and just awful situations in some cases, there's equally, if not more, good things still happening to interrupt those things. This type of setting is the perfect place to set up, plant seeds, and build that empowerment for all of you to just, the more you know, the more you can interrupt, the more you can advocate. So please feel free to call any of us. I come here unapologetically. I'm not afraid to do my work, so you all can call me. You can email me. If you sleep on something and you have a question tomorrow, email me, call. I'd love to engage in conversation. But like I said, recognizing this is such a complex topic, and it goes much deeper than what I could offer you all today, but I hope it was enough to just understand some of the dynamics that we're fighting against and what we're trying to remedy in the work. So I appreciate all of you, and I want to wish you a good weekend.